Okay, so curious conversations for collaboration fitted better on the top of a slide than the official title. So apologies for the slight change there. What we're going to cover today is why collaboration matters more than ever right now. We're going to talk about the curse of the expert. We're going to talk about Dunning-Kruger and who you're being in each conversation. And we're going to question whether curiosity is the cure for that curse of expertise. We're going to have a hypothesis, we're going to test it, refine it, and we're going to think like scientists. Then we're going to look at what are the essential skills for curious and collaborative conversations. And because, if you've got a theme, you've got to really go with it. We're going to look at what the equivalent of the lab coat is, and that's about our mindset. We're going to look at the microscope that we need, and that's how we ask great questions. And we're going to look at data collection, which is about how we gather the information, as you'd expect, and how we listen in conversations. And then, as we've mentioned, I'm a coach. So while it's great fun to come and talk to you today, what really matters to me is what you do with this. So we're going to talk about some possible next steps. I'm going to keep this as practical as I can as we go through, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So why collaboration matters more than ever? Well, I'm taking it from the fact you're on this call that you kind of get this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this section. But if we think about the economic situation we find ourselves in, wherever we are in the world, so here in the UK, in the US, anywhere else that you are, and I know we've got people from all around the world here, we do know that the economic situation everywhere is tighter than it normally is. We've also, as we bounce back from the global pandemic, the way we work is changing. We're all trying to work out what this remote hybrid working is, what's really going to work for us, what's going to work for our organizations, what's going to work for our teams. What people want from work is changing. And as a leader, whether you've got a team, whether you're leading a project, or whether you're just leading your own career, and that's a very big thing to do anyway, we need to start understanding more about what great work looks and feels like for people if we're going to get the best from them. We're hearing in the media everywhere about the great resignation. We're hearing about quiet quitting, and those in my mind are all reactions to what's happened in the world around us and how we feel about our work. What we want for great collaboration and great results is for people to feel valued in what they do. And one way to do that is to value and be curious about them and what matters to them and their ideas and incorporate them into our thinking. Now, one of the things that I find with a lot of it, particularly new leaders that I work with, is they feel they need to know all the answers. Well, that's a really big ask because none of us have answers at the moment to the world situation. And in any project or in any role, no matter how brilliant we are, we don't need to know everything. What we need to know is how to get that information. And that comes from other people and being curious about what they know. Our businesses, our projects need to be able to respond to the world rapidly. We've proved to ourselves we can do that, but we need it to be really sustainable. We can't work in silos anymore. We need to be able to work with our colleagues in different departments, in different geographies, and quite often in different companies to get the best results for our businesses. In IT, here in IT, we're used to doing that in a project format. But how can we really unlock the power of having all those people in one room? Well, as you've guessed from the title, for me, that comes down to collaboration. And great collaboration has some foundational skills, of which curiosity is, in my mind, the most important one. So let's look at why that doesn't automatically spring to mind for people. And I'm going to start by talking about what I call the curse of the expert. If you think about project teams you've been involved in, or teams you get invited into, or even just meetings you're invited in because you know about something. You are the expert in something. And that's great, but it doesn't always help us. And I don't know if you've come across this before, but this model really helped me understand some things. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And if we think about when we're learning something new and we look at how much we know versus how confident we are in what we know. So we've got knowledge along the bottom axis and confidence on the vertical one. When we first find out about something and we know we don't know anything. So we start at the bottom left on this picture and then we learn a little bit and our confidence rockets up. And we get to this point where we think we know everything. And it's kind of that false confidence. And it's sometimes called the peak of stupidity for a number of reasons, as you can see on the picture. but it happens to all of us with anything we learn. And then we kind of hit this realization that there's more to whatever it is that we're learning about than we thought, and maybe we're not so great at it. We then hit this kind of valley of despair where we think, I'm never going to be able to do this. I just don't know. And then as we start learning some more and we get more knowledge and more experience, we start to make sense of things till we get to a point of knowing that it's complicated, that we know our stuff, but there is always more to learn, and there is a whole load of stuff, whatever environment we're working in, that we don't yet know. Now, as the expert, we know we've been put on that team because we know something, which kind of encourages us to be at that peak of knowledge and understanding. So when we first come into a team, and if you think about teams you've been in, quite often we've set that expectation on ourselves that I'm here because I'm great and I know my stuff and I know about this. And other people expect us to know it. So that the encouragement to be the armchair expert, or to know everything and to have to know everything, is really, really strong. And I think, kind of as a bit of a side note, if you've spent any time on LinkedIn or on any social media or even in the press, looking at the press, there is just this huge push towards knowing a little bit about everything and claiming to know everything there is about it, as people become these kind of pocket experts, and we're encouraged to do that. Now, knowing about things is amazing and wonderful, and I'm not discouraging that on any level, but it can be a real barrier to collaboration, because what happens when we think we know everything is we stop thinking, and we're hardwired as human beings to fill in the gaps between our knowledge with a whole load of assumptions. Curiosity for me is about unpicking those assumptions we're making and making room for new information, new knowledge, new facts that might help us get to the best possible decision. So for me, curiosity is key to great decision making, because you're a bit about gathering the facts. So if we're busy being an expert, as I say, that has some challenges for us in conversations and in collaboration. And when we hit those, it tends to create a frustration. And I'm not going to ask you to comment in the chat about whether you've ever been in one of those meetings where everybody thinks they're right and you're having maybe a violent agreement about the outcome because nobody is listening to what's been said. So you're all saying the same thing, but you're all busy knowing best. And that can be really frustrating because it slows progress down. So as individuals, we get more and more wound up and we get more and more entrenched in our position, all because we've started out as the expert. And paradoxically, it stops us being great as individuals, and it stops us being great as a team. And if we think about the project environment that we're so familiar with here in IT, it stops us contributing well to that project team, and it stops the project delivering for the business. If as the IT people on a project, we think we know more about the business, which we may or may not do, than the people we're working with, that's going to be a real barrier to them changing and moving along with us to deliver a great project in collaboration. So the question for me then is, how can we flip this? How can we make it that we can lean into our expertise, get to the right-hand side of that Dunning-Kruger model where we know what we know, but we also know what we don't know, and really use that to help us collaborate effectively? Well, the first thing to understand is that we all have a choice about how we show up in a conversation. It doesn't always feel like it, but we do. And we can role model showing up with curiosity for ourselves and our teams, even when we're not the leader of that team. Now, that can make us a little bit vulnerable. It can feel very clunky and uncomfortable to start with. But as we get towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to share with you some ways to really bring that to life for yourself and your teams and those around you. Now, there was a guy, Philip Tetlock, I can't even say his name now, he's really good, it's worth reading, Phil Tetlock, who is an American-Canadian professor of science and judgment and decision making. And he noticed that we all show up as one of three professions in every conversation. So he grouped those as the preacher, the politician, or the prosecutor. I'm going to take you through each of those, and we're going to look at what it means and what impact that has on collaboration. So let's look at the preacher first, and this may be the most intuitive one. And all three of these have some real benefits for us in our leadership, in our world of work, but they also have some challenges or danger zones or things that we need to be aware of when we're using them. So when we show up as the preacher, we do that when we're wanting to defend our beliefs or our position. And we kind of step into giving a sermon and just promoting our ideas and our ideals. Now, that's obviously has its uses, and there are times where you need to be the evangelist, the preacher for whatever it is you and your team are delivering. But it does have an impact on how we collaborate. So it's very useful when we're sharing our solutions and our thoughts, but it means that we tend not to be open to new ideas or ideas from others. And those ideas might be totally new, or they might be great ways of building on what we've already got going on. Now, if you think about the people in the room when you're preaching, and if you're preaching and preaching and preaching in the light of new information, it can make us seem very defensive. And if you think about when you're in a room with some people being very defensive, what tends to happen is we close down as well. It's a very human reaction, and we just get into loggerheads a bit. And we all tend to stop listening, and we stop noticing those points of similarity. And that's where what I call these violent agreements happen, where the conversation is escalating on every level, be that intellectually, be that volume-wise, because we're not seeing that we're saying the same thing. So great when you want to share your thoughts, but a bit of a danger about letting people in to understand their perspective and how it can build on what you're doing. So that's the preacher. If we look at the politician, and we will need to park our views on our own particular politicians in our own countries while we think about this isn't what he's getting at. He's talking about when we are taking on the role of somebody looking to win over people to their point of view and to gain consent for an idea. Now, that obviously that campaigning and lobbying for approval is really great in helping us gather support for an idea or proposal and to get people aligned behind it. And we know in any project, if we want to get it to happen, we need to be able to align people behind that idea, behind the big change, the big thing that we're delivering. Now, depending how you play being the politician, it can come across as very insincere and untrustworthy, because people aren't clear what we think and what we stand for. So it needs balancing with some of the other ways of showing up in the conversation. So again, really helpful and potentially not great for relationships and collaboration at the same time. So again, needs using with care. And then finally, we have the prosecutor. Now, when I describe this one, almost every time I do, somebody will spring into your mind and go, yeah, I know several of those. They're really challenging to work with. But actually, they have some benefits for us as well. And we use this when we spot flaws in other people's arguments or their position or their ideas. And we then set about proving them wrong. And we keep going and going and going until we've proved that we're right and they're wrong. So it can be useful as a style if you need to present a really logical case for something, or you're sharing your thinking. And it can help you make sure you've checked your facts, or that somebody else has checked their facts. So that's really good as well. But it can be hugely damaging to relationships. And I think this is why this one springs to mind most easily for people. Because if you know somebody who, even if their intent is good, is always picking holes in what you're saying, the natural reaction is to stop sharing ideas with them. And it can, if it's used from a leader's perspective too much, it can lead to a very fear-based culture, and a culture of people who just say yes to whatever you want, which might feel great in terms of I don't get any arguments from people, but it fundamentally stops collaboration, and it puts the leader back into this position where everything's down to them and we don't get great outcomes. And I know you want to be great leaders, so being aware of the impact of using this too much can have, and there are ways to prosecute without it being quite as damaging, which are probably the topic for another conversation. So those are the three that Phil Tetlock talked about. So they've all got strengths, they've all got weaknesses, but they don't necessarily give one overall picture and one overall way of working that's great. So the next question for me then is curiosity the cure for this? Now, I've kind of thought it was for a long time, but I was very relieved when Adam Grant wrote a book called Think Again, and he talked about an additional position here as well, the position that he calls the scientist. Now, if you haven't read Adam Grant's book, Think Again, regardless of anything else you take from this webinar, I'd highly recommend reading it. It's a fantastically interesting read. And yes, I am recommending it to everybody I know. No, I'm not on commission, but I really wish I was. So we bring the scientist, we meet the scientist when we're searching for the truth and the best outcomes. We question what we think we know. And if you think about the Dunning-Kruger effect over on the right-hand side, that knowing that we don't know is a central hypothesis in Adam Grant's book. And when we know that there are the things we don't know, rather than filling in the gaps, we form a hypothesis. We look at what could make it work. And we then go and test that hypothesis. We know that we don't know everything. Now, if you think about going into a conversation with a team or a group of people with that mindset and the impact that has on collaboration, well, it means we're actively seeking differences in our thinking. So we might present an idea going, I'm thinking this, what do you think? And it allows us to combine our ideas. And we know intuitively that by combining ideas, we come up with another way that's better than any one individual's thoughts. It allows everyone to bring what I call their best thinking. So it encourages us to really think things through and to bounce ideas off each other properly. We engage everybody in the conversation. And if we think back to the very beginning when we were talking about why collaboration is even more important at the moment and the need for people to feel valued at work, if they're engaged in a conversation, they're feeling valued, we get some really great outputs. It also allows us to make great decisions in rapidly changing environments. And we all know that that is something that's here to stay. We know that even before COVID and all the rapid changes in that, even before hybrid and remote working, that the rate of change in the world around us was growing exponentially. And we still need to be able to make great decisions where what we know today might not be what we know tomorrow. And some of those underlying assumptions that we're making in making those decisions may well change. So what coming at a conversation or at a decision even and a collaboration with a scientific approach allows us to do is it allows us to note down our assumptions. So what are the conditions that allow the decision we're making to stay valid? And because we know that when one of those conditions changes, we can revisit it and, if necessary, update our decisions. So it's a bit like running a risk log. You have that list of things that could go wrong. You have the same with your decisions, and you can then decide what you're going to do. What also happens when we come at conversations this way is people really enjoy the conversation. They're energized by them. If you walk past a real life meeting or even just somebody on a Zoom meeting who's having one of these really great collaborative, curiosity-based conversations, you'll notice it's noisy. It's not that people are talking over each other. It's just they're getting really excited about it. Now, I'm also, I should point out, I'm very aware I'm sitting here using preacher and politician and encouraging you to be a scientist. So I'm aware there's a slight hypocrisy in that based on the format of what we're doing. But hopefully it will allow you to understand and see those differences. So that's our scientist. And that's all very well and good. So we've thought about what are the different ways we can show up in a conversation and why taking that curiosity or scientific based approach is really going to enable us to unlock what's going on in the teams that we're part of and the teams we're collaborating with. And that's great. And we all love a bit of theory, don't we? But what does it mean in real life? What are the skills you need to have a curious and collaborative conversation? Well, for me, as I said earlier, it comes down to three things. It comes down to putting on your scientific lab coat, and that's taking the scientific approach. And that's, if you like, a mindset thing. I kind of hesitate to call it that. It's a way of approaching conversations. You have your microscope. How are you going to find out? How are you going to see the world literally through a different lens? Well, that comes down to the questions you ask. And you need to be able to collect that data, because generating information, great. If you don't collect it, you've been wasting your time. And that's about listening to really understand. So let's look at each of those in turn. And if you just excuse me a moment, we'll have a sip of water. Excuse me, sorry. Okay, so donning your scientific approach lab coat, and if it helps you to literally get a white lab coat and put it on, I'm not going to stop you and I'm not going to judge you. It's a state of mind, though. It's an approach. I think it's really important to realize it's not about maths and formulas. You don't have to have been great at science at school to be good at this. You don't even have to be good at maths or structured thinking in that way to be great at this. But it is about having intellectual humility. So knowing that you don't know everything and really generating that curiosity and that desire and that wanting to know more. Now, interestingly, and if you're finding curiosity hard, take a small pat on the back. This isn't about intelligence. What the research has shown us is actually the more intelligent you are, the harder it can be to stay curious. So if you're struggling, notice that. That's great. Think, yeah, that obviously means I know a lot of stuff, and still look for the gaps and what else you can be learning. Now, there are some side effects of putting on this scientific lab coat. You need to get comfortable with not always being right and having your opinion challenged and changing your mind. Now, for some of us, that's harder than others. But the more comfortable we are with being flexible in our thinking, the more easily we're going to be able to collaborate and build that better solution with the people around us. One way of helping us do that is to think of it a bit like a game, or set yourself a challenge. You'll know what works best for you. And it's to find out what you can learn in each and every conversation. If you go into every conversation thinking, what am I going to learn from this? You'll be in a great place of curiosity. You'll know you're doing it very naturally when you go for coffee and you want to see what you can find out about the barista who's making that wonderful drink for you. But if you challenge yourself to see what you can learn in each conversation, I doubt you'll ever be disappointed, and you will get into the habit of being very curious. Decide that you don't have to have the perfect answer. You need the best answer for now. And if we think about our rapidly changing worlds, that's really important. And that also sets the tone for collaboration and that answer evolving as things go on. The other question I get asked quite a lot is, what do I need to be curious about? And the short answer is everything, anything and everything. So yes, about your business, about other people's businesses, about people themselves, about ideas and concepts, about the world around you, about worlds you know nothing about. The less you know about it, the easier it is to be curious, because the more there is to learn. So look for those things that you know nothing about and see what you can learn and assimilate from them. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever suffered from this, but that nagging imposter complex voice that comes along sometimes, you know, that one that tells you, who are you to think you're good enough to do this? Well, when it does appear, if it does appear, use that as another source of curiosity. Why is that naughty nagging internal voice telling you that? What is it that you need to go find out more about? What can you learn from that? What's worrying you? It's a great tool for helping you focus that curiosity in the moment. You need to be open to possibilities. That sounds really easy and a bit yoga, but actually if you're able to suspend your judgment and be open to the possibility that there's a better way, you will naturally be in that place of curiosity. And I've talked about this a couple of times, that we fill in the gaps, we make assumptions, we make judgments, particularly about people and about ideas. And if we think one thing about a person, we tend to either believe all their ideas or write all those ideas off. We need to get practice at suspending that judgment. And that's not always easy. I do totally acknowledge that. So what are some ways, very practically, you can build this into your day? Well, sharing your ideas with others, testing them and encouraging other people to make a contribution. Now, the first time you do this with a group of people, it might feel a bit uncomfortable, particularly if you've been working with a team and you've always gone in and just said, here's the idea, just go and do it. Then if you suddenly come in and say, I've got this idea, what do you think? Don't be surprised if it takes them a while to warm up to telling you a bit more about it, but persevere and maybe tell them you want to try something different before you do it. So share an idea before it's fully formed. Encourage other people to make that contribution. we all know people who constructively challenge our thinking. I'm not talking about the kind of people who just put you down. I'm not talking about the prosecutors or people who are always acting as if they're a prosecutor, but find those people who challenge your thinking, ask you to explain more, and really help you dive into what you're thinking. They'll help you build your curiosity and get used to wearing that leadership scientific lab coat. Jester's license is a great one, and I am privileged enough to go in at the start of a lot of projects. In the consultancy work that I do, I get to go join a team, sometimes at the start of a project, sometimes just after. And what I love about going into a new project, one of the many things, is that you get to use what I call the jester's license. Now, if you think about ancient mythology, the jester was always there to help the king by asking the obvious, apparently stupid questions. Well, when you're new in a situation, you can really easily bring out your jester's license, and people don't expect you to know things. So you can ask those really obvious questions that actually are the ones that everybody's been thinking but not asking, because they just feel they should know the answer. Whereas as somebody new, you can do that. Now, as you get more practiced at doing that, you can bring out what you call your jester's license. And I've been known to sit in meetings with teams I've been in for a very long time and say, look, I just want to get the jester's license out for a minute. Let's assume we know nothing. What's going on here? Why are we doing this? What's happening with that? Where's the other? And asking those really obvious questions and getting comfortable with doing that. The other thing you can do is get scientific about getting scientific. And this might seem a bit meta, but it's about getting into the way of thinking. So make a note of how well you do about an aspect of this for a few days, analyze it, see what the data is telling you, come up on a hypothesis based on what you do well, what's harder for you, and then go test it out. And what you'll see is that you continuously improve. The suspending judgment one we've talked about a little bit, but if you pick somebody who you find it really hard to suspend your judgment on and go into a conversation with them, looking to see what you can learn from them, that's a really great way of starting. Now, I'm a big fan of reflective practice, as the getting scientific about getting scientific might have given you a clue, but keeping a journal of what you've learned each day will help you stay curious and do something with that information. So that's the leadership lab coat, and I'm sure you'll have lots of great ideas about how you can pop that on and really think like a scientist in your role as a leader. But let's then look at how are you going to get information? Because if we're going to form a hypothesis, we need some data to do that. And basically, in the analogy here, our microscope, our lens on the world, we get that through the questions that we ask. Now, intuitively, you probably know that not all questions are the same. And what's really important to remember is that the intent behind your question will inform how you ask it. And the way I like to think about it is a good question is one that encourages somebody to speak. A really good question also encourages them to think. So if their answer starts with, then for me, that's a really good question, because they're not just parroting something off. It's not moved their thinking forward. But if we want to get to a great question, that doesn't happen until we've gone in to really learn something from them. Because with the previous two, we can still lead somebody's thinking, and we don't necessarily leave them open to giving us, we don't necessarily give them an easy way to give us new information. And if we're being curious, that's what we're looking for. So what makes a great question? Absolutely the intent behind it, that intent to learn. How you structure the question is really, really important. Who gave you that? Who's important in this? What's going on? When did that happen? Where did you see this? And my absolute favorite, it's not technically a question. Can you tell me more? That just encourages them to keep going and keep going and keep going. Interestingly, and if you're used to who, what, when, where, why, and how and why is not a great question for encouraging curiosity. If you think about when somebody asks you, why did you do that? What happens internally for us is we close down and we start justifying what we've done. Now, that has a place in helping us understand somebody's thinking, but it doesn't open up their mind to give us really great information. And once somebody's mind closes down in a conversation, it's harder to open it back up again. So I'd really encourage you to look for ways of asking why without asking why. So something like in the example I gave, can you take me through your thinking, is a lot easier to answer then why did you think that? Because we're not feeling we have to justify it. We have no need to prove we're right. We're just taking them through what we're thinking. And as the other person in that conversation looking to collaborate, that gives us those points of similarity and those points of difference that we can build on each other's thinking. Now, there are some common challenges with asking great questions. I mentioned one a little while ago, and that's asking questions where the answer you want is obvious. I see this really often around projects and when we're working with the business unit, maybe about their process, and it's really clear to them what we want them to say, and that might be because of the words we're using, it might be because we nod during one answer and shake our head during another. I see it a lot when we're interviewing. We might ask somebody, your experience with doing this is really important, isn't it? Tell me about it. At which point we've kind of told them that we need some really great examples there. The other challenge we have, and this one comes from a point of enthusiasm generally, and not pausing to think before we ask our great questions, is what I call the question cannon. Have you ever been on the receiving end of something that feels like a fire hydrant of questions where it's this, ask, and telling me, and then what about, and what happens then is the person we're asking questions for knows we've got a lot we want to ask, but we overwhelm their brain a little bit and they don't know where to start. So we need to avoid asking a question cannon. So 2 or 3 questions on the bounce. Let's do one, and then do the next, and then do the next, and see where the conversation goes. And that leads to the last common challenge, is that because we've started processing that information that somebody's given us, we veer off at 90, 180 degrees to what we were already be talking about, and we change the subject from the listener's perspective or the answerer's perspective really unexpectedly. And what that does is it closes down an avenue of thinking that we've opened up before necessarily that person is ready to do that. So those are some of the common challenges around asking questions. So ways to build that into your day. How do you think you could do this? You'll know some. And I've got some suggestions here to get you started. You can make a list of what I call power questions you can use. So my one being, can you tell me more? So have ones that sound like you, because you don't want to sound like Bekka in your conversation, or your team really will think you've gone a little bit crazy because that hasn't been your style to now. So pick ones that sound natural to you and you feel comfortable using and that become automatic. And if you find yourself in similar situations each time, look at those questions and see how you could refine them to make them even better. Classic one for me is if you're working as a business analyst, there'll be a set of questions you ask users each time. Are those really great questions, or are they questions where it's kind of obvious what the answer should be and where you're guiding their thinking? Be really clear which you're doing and why you're doing it and what the right circumstances for each of those are. So you can think about how you work with your team. What questions are you using with them on a regular basis, and could you make them even better? If you've got people working for you, or you're working with people on a project where you're doing one-to-ones with them, how do you open those conversations up? What questions do you have of them? But also think about who you could practice asking great questions with. If you and somebody else on your team or one of your peers is looking to improve how you ask questions, why not work on it together? What would happen if you did? What might you both learn? And then the last part of it for me to think about is, how are you going to know which questions work really well for you and for the team? Well, if you think about that again, we're back to the scientific process. So record, analyze, hypothesize, and keep trying it and refining what you're doing. So that's 2 out of our 3 essential skills. And it's great. And we've got all this wonderful information coming at us. We've got these great collaborative conversations beginning to happen. But a conversation is a two-way thing, and collaboration requires us to not just get that information out of people, it requires us to internalize it and do something with it. I'm sure you've had conversation where somebody's asked you loads of great questions, you've given loads of information, and you know it's been a total waste of your time because they didn't pay attention, they weren't listening, they've maybe gone off and done something else during the conversation even, which can be really frustrating. We can listen at different levels at different times, and listening well is hard work and it requires energy. What's interesting for me is it's not something that many of us are taught to do. And if we are taught, we're taught to be active listeners. But in my mind, that's not enough. We need to listen to understand the other person's perspective before we can collaborate. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this. If you want to know more, there is a previous webinar I've done with the great IT pro called, I think, When Active Listening Isn't Enough, or Why Active Listening Isn't Enough. So this is a whistle-stop tour of that, and you can go and listen to the other one. I think it's a relatively short one. I think it's 15-20 minutes on just this. So not going to give you the full thing now. But basically, if you think of it as a staircase where we start on the bottom step, where somebody is in the same space, but effectively they're ignoring us. So if you are currently sat here doing your emails, listening to me in the background, got a few other things going on, then you're probably on that bottom step. And if you've got teenagers or lived with teenagers, you've probably seen that modeled really well at some point. We then move up to what the first bit are that sometimes get called active listening is, and that's pretend listening, where basically we're waiting for that pause in the conversation to speak. What then happens is we go on to selective listening, where we're waiting to disagree. So if we think about our prosecutors, they're really good at this. And if we think about the skills we're taught as consultants, if you're in the consulting world, we're quite often taught to be at this point, listen for where you can give them a different point of view. That's selective listening. Where we want to be is up on the next step, or even the one after it. And that's in attentive listening, where we're listening to understand somebody's perspective. So we're really interacting internally with what they're telling us. And then if we want to take it to the top level, then actually we're listening from their frame of reference. So we've got so far into their map of the world, and our intent is totally to be in their world, then we can move to there. So where we need to aim to be when we're collaborating is at least attentive listening. Hoping that all makes sense. I would just say quickly, if you're thinking I'm saying you need to be attentive listening all the time, you don't. That would be exhausting, even if you're really practiced at it. And this is a muscle that you can build. The other kind of nuance around listening that I do want to run through in a little bit more detail today is that we all have different listening styles. So it goes back to that point about our intent when we're listening and the difference that makes when we're doing it to help us get to understanding and empathetic listening. You might be an analytical listener, so you're aiming to listen from a neutral point of view and you're aiming to evaluate what you're hearing. You might be a relational listener, which is about building connection and understanding of the emotion behind the message. And that's kind of what I call listening between the lines. So a bit like reading between the lines, but doing it when you're listening. You might be a task-focused listener, and that's somebody who shapes the conversation to get the information they need very efficiently. And as you can see with these, they've all got their place, but they've all got their downsides as well. And the fourth one to think through is about being a critical listener, and that's where we judge somebody based on the content of what they're saying and on our opinion of the speaker. So what does that mean for collaboration? Well, the two in green, so the analytical listener and the relational listener, they're obviously really great for building collaboration. You're aiming to be neutral, you're aiming to build that connection, that relationship. So they're a great place to be from a leadership and a collaboration perspective. Task-focused listener, I've put on amber because it depends. Sometimes it's really good from a collaboration perspective in that you need to get people working towards something together and you do need to shape that conversation. But it can mean that you don't get all the information that you need. So that curiosity is contained within task-focused listening. If you're a critical listener, you're shutting down the collaboration. So I've put that one in red. So that's the other thing to think through while you're listening. So again, ways we can build doing this into our days. So it all starts with observing, noticing where you are on that listening staircase and what styles you're using in which situations. Then, when you've done that, you can form a hypothesis about what helps you listen really well. Then you can go test it out. And you can experiment with the impact of different styles and different levels of listening. Obviously, if something's a really high pressure meeting and a really important meeting, not the time to go experiment. But there'll be some meetings and some interactions and some conversations where it's safer to play with it. So do that. as I say, listening well and listening effectively to collaborate takes practice, and it's a muscle and a skill you need to build. So absolutely go practice it. And one way to help you focus on what level you need to be listening at and what listening style you need to bring in is to think about why you're listening in that conversation. Are you trying to collaborate? Are you trying to just drive a decision? What is it you want out of that conversation? Then decide what level of listening you want to go in. So you've probably come into this webinar not necessarily needing to empathetically understand where I'm at, but hopefully coming in with enough curiosity to listen to what I've got to say. The other quick trick that can really help you keep you listening in the zone it needs to be is to notice who's the focus of a conversation and check how you're doing. If you've gone into a conversation to collaborate and to listen, and you're talking 95% of the time, or 100% as I am right now, you're probably not listening that well. If the focus is on the other person, great. You're probably doing much better. So just look at where you are on that scale as a little quick kind of health check during a conversation. Okay, I just want to wrap with a bit of a so what. I think we intuitively know that when we collaborate, we get better results. When we think in a curiously collaborative way, surely that should be even better. It just kind of makes sense. But there was some interesting research carried out in Italy with 100 founders of very diverse startup businesses. They were split into two groups as they went through a 4-month business development program. One group were assigned to a group where they were learning to take a very scientific approach, and the other were not, basically. And what they found is over the next year, the group who followed the scientific approach brought in over 12,000 Italian lira in revenue compared to just 300 for the control group, and they brought that revenue in twice as quickly. Obviously, that's a huge difference for those businesses. What's interesting is when they looked at what their hypothesis as to what had caused that, the why was that, they figured that it was because the founders were less wedded to their original ideas and pivoted more as they noticed what wasn't working sooner. Now, those are all great attributes for us as leaders. So, quick summary for you. Next steps, as I said, I kind of hope that you've got something from this presentation. So a way to think that through and to decide what next, because if you implemented all of this all at once, that would be overwhelming and you've got day jobs to do. So what I suggest you do is think about what ideas really stood out for you in this presentation. Then decide which one you think will make the biggest difference in how you collaborate right now. Then ask yourself, how are you going to put that idea into action? Get really specific. And as Susan said at the beginning, if you've got any questions that we don't get to cover in what's left of the time, you can always email me. So Susan, I'm going to hand back over to you.
Bekka, we thank you so much for presenting with us today, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you for having me.